Good evening, loyal and brave New Yorkers who came out tonight in a drizzle, even, for what I think will be one of the finest panels assembled this season at the Center for Jewish History. It's so rare that we get to have a group of women as distinguished as these three on stage talking about, thank you kindly, talking about women in history. It's a subject that I personally and these other fine women have been working on for many, many years. And I think it's an important subject. And I think tonight we will all learn much and explore together a topic that I think is really one of the few very underexplored topics, particularly in Holocaust history, but I would say in the subject of meta-history in general, which is something we're going to get into tonight. My name is Rochelle Lithgow, and I'm the Executive Director of the American Jewish Historical Society. I'm going to start by introducing our panelists and then telling you a little bit about what inspired us to get together today, meaning the exhibition, which I hope you've all seen in the Popper Gallery right outside. And then we'll open up the discussion from there. How does that sound? It's good? Okay. So I'll start from left to right, this being the Center for Jewish History and all. Elisa von Joeden-Forgey is someone I'm very honored to know as a friend and colleague. She is the assistant professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Richard Stockton College. She teaches both graduate and undergraduate courses on Holocaust history, comparative genocide, sexual violence, human rights, and genocide prevention, which she's been a real pioneer in that field. She has degrees from both Columbia and a PhD from Penn, where she also taught for many years and completed her doctoral dissertation on Africans in Germany and their fates during the war. She's received many, many research grants and is now working on a book for UPenn Press on gender and genocide prevention. At Stockton, she's also developing a master's program in genocide prevention and co-chairing research and teaching committee on sexualized violence on campus and as part of a global conversation. So she is the perfect person to be a part of our panel tonight. Rochelle Saidel, who I'm also pleased to call friend and colleague, is the founder and executive director of the Remember the Women Institute. They have a newsletter outside, which I encourage all of you to take. She's based in New York City, but also spends much time in Israel. The Remember the Women Institute is a not-for-profit. It's based in New York. They do research and cultural projects that integrate women into history. Her own focus is women during the Holocaust. She wrote The Jewish Women of Ravensbrück concentration camp, which is a fine, fine book. If you have not read it, I suggest it highly. And she co-authored Sexual Violence Against Jewish Women During the Holocaust, which is a very underdocumented and important subject. She's also the editor of an expanded edition of the memoir of Ravensbrück survivor Fiorello's sister, Gemma LaGuardia Gluck's story, and the author of 3 other books about the Holocaust. And she's written and lectured extensively around the world. Marisa Fox is my new friend, and a New York-based journalist who has appeared in everything from O Magazine to Rolling Stone to the New York Times to Haaretz. Though most of her career was spent editing and writing celebrity cover stories, women's health and lifestyle features, she's made a complete 180 professionally. 5 years ago, she learned that her deceased mother had a double life. She went into her mother's Polish hometown to gather evidence, where she found a birth certificate confirming that everything she thought she knew about her mother was wrong. She spent the past 4 years finding witnesses to her mother's secret, which included 4.5 years in a Nazi slave labor camp in the Czech Republic, detailed in a diary that her mother wrote in, along with 60 other young girls. This communal camp journal is currently in a basement at Yad Vashem, and has been the key in helping her unlock her mother's secret and linking her to a sisterhood of women joined together by the Holocaust. She's currently working on a book and a documentary about her mother's past, as well as a short film about Israeli female survivors who took very unorthodox approaches to sharing their histories. So as you can see, we have a dream team panel here to have this conversation. I just want to backtrack for a minute to talk about why we decided to do this tonight. My own history has been, as a Holocaust historian, and about a year ago, I defected and became an Americanist. And I had been long writing about these particular 4 women and other women in Holocaust history, particularly in the field of resistance. I was the executive director of the Los Angeles Museum of the Holocaust for many years, and as it happens, there were many, many women in Los Angeles who shared with me that they had been part of varying resistance movements in Europe, from passing messages in the underground to working sort of in the organization of resistance in camp, even sort of passive nonviolent resistance. There were some women who had were living secret lives in Munich, for example, that helped the White Rose distribute their leaflets. And these stories would come out, and they were very shy when they would share them with me. And before I was at the museum, I worked as the head of research for the Shoah Foundation, which is now the USC Shoah Foundation Institute. And there I watched many, many testimonies of women who had been involved, and in some cases sexually brutalized. And they were very reluctant to share those stories. And so with these 4 women that I had been thinking about for some time, I began to think about the 70th anniversary of their death that had been coming up. And I was in Philadelphia, and I saw an exhibition at the Fabric Warehouse Museum, which was done by Jonah Beaucaire, who is an artist, a visual artist, a choreographer, a dancer, really just a remarkable man. And I had been familiar with his work, and I saw the exhibition in Philadelphia, and he had in it a film of 4 young women in a sort of monochromatic scheme, moving very slowly through space. And I was quite mesmerized by the presentation. And I reached out to him afterwards and told him that I was very moved by the work, and that I had been thinking about 4 other women. And I asked him if he had ever done a remembrance project or a commission to do a historical representation. And he said, not really, but I've always wanted to. What are you thinking about? And I sent him some research, some small research pieces that I had done and some articles. And he came back to me several weeks later with research he had done about these women. He got very moved and interested. And we started a 2-year back and forth conversation. And we were fortunate enough to be able to commission him. He's very much in demand. He only does, I think, 2 new works a year, is that it? And so we commissioned him to do the film that you see, 4 women in the gallery, and it turned into a full exhibition. And it opened 70 years to the day of the revolt. And this is sort of what inspired me to reach out to Rochelle and talk to her about this and seek her counsel and get her input. And she said, well, why don't we do something about this? Why don't we have a panel? And I said, of course we'll have a panel. And that is how we all ended up here tonight. And I think the story of these women is remarkable. And I just want to ask one question to sort of kick off our conversation. The names Esther Voxblum, Regina Sofferston, Roja Rabota, and Alla Gertner. How many people in this room had heard of those names? Now, I would say this is a fairly educated audience, and very few of you raised your hands. I think these women were remarkable in many ways, but chief among them that they did this because they just believed this was what they should do, and they paid for it with their lives. They were the last public execution of Auschwitz. For those of you who don't know, the camp was liberated maybe about 2 weeks later. The date of the hanging is in somewhat dispute. Some say it was January 5th, some say the 7th, some say the 3rd. As with much of this kind of history, it's fluid. But Auschwitz was liberated by the Russians on January 20th. So they were tortured. They refused to divulge the names of any of their co-conspirators, in some cases their own siblings. And they were hung 2 at a time for their crime. And that's why I asked if you had known who these women were, because it's a story that, you know, most of us don't have any comprehension of. So on that note, I wanted to start, excuse me, yeah.
If you didn't see the, is this on? If you didn't see the exhibit before, do go see it afterward, not now. And I think you'll learn something about it there, and once you have the brochure.
It's on the table.
Which is on the table as you came in. You may have it in your hands now. And, you know, some of the names are a Google away. There's information on both of our websites. You'll find information.
Just to give you a 2-sentence context, 3 of the women, with the exception of Roja, worked in the munitions factory. They were recruited, I would say, by Roja Robota, who had connections from her town, from her other Polish friends, and the women were asked to smuggle minute quantities of gunpowder from the munitions factory where they worked. They secreted it under their nails and in the cuffs of their dresses, and they would wrap it in small rags and pass it along the chain. And the Sonderkommando, the group of men who were forced to work the death installations at Auschwitz, would then take the powder and also secret it away. The actual plan was to blow up all 5 crematoria at once and make a break for it. The Sonderkommando for Crematoria 4 learned that they themselves were about to be liquidated. So they were the keepers of the powder, and they decided it was now or never. So they ignited the charge. About 200 men escaped. They were all captured within a day or 2, and they were all murdered. The Nazis launched an investigation. The women were quite young. They were naive. I think they didn't realize that they could determine the characteristics of gunpowder and where it was manufactured. They traced it to this particular area where the women worked, and they were betrayed. We're not clear who betrayed them, and they were tortured and hung. So that's the very briefest context. I want to start with a kind of a meta question, which really is, you know, why have women been left out of history in general? Specifically Holocaust history, but we can go out in concentric circles from there. And I wonder if Rochelle wants to maybe start the conversation.
Okay, thank you, and thank you, Rachel, for being a really good institutional partner, beside being a friend, for making this happen. One word before I talk about women and their place in Holocaust history, because I said that information is a Google away, and there's a lot of misinformation that's also a Google away. And so if you are going to try and research what happened, you know, pay attention and see what might be real and what compares and what doesn't. And when I was doing some research. I'm really no expert on this specific incident, and now I'm more of one than I was when I started. But I had a book in my possession, which I'm sure is out of print, from 1996 by Laura Shelley, who wrote a book about the munitions factory women. And she was very meticulous. She was a survivor herself of Auschwitz. Because she was German speaking, she was one of the Nazi secretaries that they had put into the offices. She also did a book on the secretaries. And she interviewed many of these women, and I read it, and I read between the lines, and I read the lines, and I think from that I really got a pretty good overview of it. And because all of the women who worked in the munitions factory were sent on a death march on January 18, 1945, and they were sent to Ravensbrück, which I am pretty much of an expert on. I knew some of these women who survived, and I knew Laura Shelley, and I had read the book a long time ago when I was writing my book on Ravensbrück, but I paid very little attention to what happened before the death march on January 18th, so it was really wonderful for me to start from the beginning with what Laura wrote and learn about what happened in October 1944, and then the hanging in the beginning of January 1945. I'll try to give a brief overview of about 30 years in 5 minutes or so of placing women in Holocaust history, why it took so long, why in some cases it still hasn't happened. The first event that actually brought to the fore this question of women during the Holocaust was not until 1983, when Esther Katz and Joan Ringelheim had a conference at Stern College on women during the Holocaust, women surviving the Holocaust. This was very controversial. It came in the wake of the women's movement, which was sometime before that, but it took some time, and there were a lot of complaints about it. There were complaints, I was there. There were complaints by survivors. And then there was a group of very militant New York City Jewish lesbians, and then there were questions about sexuality and sexual violence in the camp, especially by this militant group. And then the survivors got incensed, and I don't know if any of you were there, but it was really quite intense. And beside that, because I would say less so in America, but more so in Israel, and I kind of operate in both worlds, the Holocaust is kind of in a sacred box, and once you're trying to break into that sacred space and learn some specifics of what unfortunately happened, there are people that are resenting it and trying to prevent you from doing so. So it was the beginning. And Joan Ringelheim really never published the book she should have published afterwards. She's done some articles, and she really was the pioneer in this. And it took some time. In 1993, and that's 10 years later, the first book came out on women and the Holocaust by Carol Rittner and John Roth. It was an anthology. Some of these things had been published before. It's still being used, and it's really important because it, in a book, addressed women and the Holocaust. What was so particular about a woman's experience during the Holocaust? And women did have different experiences than men. And from the beginning, with the story of the Holocaust as a whole, it was basically done, and there were exceptions, by male historians, and there was no thinking about how was it different for a woman. It was the Holocaust. It was the mass murder of 6 million Jews, and this is what we need to focus on, and you're a threat if you want to talk about women. You're a threat if you want to talk about gay victims. You're a threat if you want to talk about anything that's not the destruction of European Jewry. But really, it's okay to examine one shtetl. It's okay to examine one concentration camp. So why can't we start breaking up components and talk about women, which some of us, in fact, have been doing. In 1995, Dalia Ofer, who is a professor of Holocaust history at Hebrew University, and Lenore Weitzman, who is an American sociology professor, organized a conference in Hebrew University, and their book came out on women and the Holocaust in 1998. Another came out by Elizabeth Baer and Myrna Goldenberg in 2003, and Myrna has always been at the forefront of this issue too, and she's terrific on it. And finally, in 1999, the Scholars Conference on the Holocaust, which has been going on for decades and is quite mainstream and prestigious, and we finally had a plenary session on women and the Holocaust in 1999. We were even able to call it books in print because toward the end of the 90s, and I mentioned a couple of the books, there were some books that had come out and we were actually able to talk about them. And then the next years, some more books were out. And so a core of study was being developed, and we were able to study in a scholarly way what happened, what were some of the things we need to address about women. Now, somebody should be thinking, hey, and you're right, there were memoirs in the 1940s even, after the Holocaust, so what are you talking about, Rochelle? But I'm not talking about memoirs, I'm talking about a scholarly academic study of women during the Holocaust, including the memoirs, including documentation that can be found, to really understand a pattern of what was going on. So the memoirs, which keep coming, are important, but they're not the whole story. These books I'm talking about are analytical kinds of books. So other conferences then have been going on, and panels at conferences, and the subject has been somewhat integrated, but it's still sometimes a problem. And I began dealing with a problem of women and the Holocaust that is even more controversial than just women, which is sexual violence, which is people don't want to talk about it. We have a book about it. We have scholars from every academic field in many countries talking about it, and still we have resistance. The book started in 2006 at Yad Vashem when my colleague Sonia Hedgepeth and I were making we did a workshop for teachers on women in the Holocaust, which in itself was a miracle. And Yad Vashem doesn't like too much women in the Holocaust. So anyhow, I was talking about—
This attitude does not reflect AJHS. No, just
It does reflect Remember the Women Institute. We were giving this workshop. My talk was on Ravensbrück. It wasn't about sexual violence, but I mentioned that some women at Ravensbrück had been raped, and that forced prostitutes were sometimes taken to other camps from Ravensbrück. And a very distinguished Holocaust scholar who was a plenary speaker chose to sit in our workshop. I'll be good and not say his name. Anyhow, I've said it already once in public, but maybe I shouldn't have. Anyhow, so he started driving me crazy for the next 2 days of the conference, saying, no Jewish woman was ever raped during the Holocaust. Where are the documents? You know, like you have a rape document. You know, somebody says, I raped you, here's the document. In fact, most of the women who were raped were murdered afterward to keep them quiet, because that's the easiest thing to do, and there was no punishment for it and no problem. So this is one issue, and I mean, it's a lot of women's experiences during the Holocaust had to do with the biology of being a woman, not only vulnerability for sexual violence, but menstruation and childbirth and forced abortion and forced sterilization, and all of these things that really are women's experiences that need to be talked about. There were also other aspects of being a woman, somebody, I can't prove this statistically, but from what I have seen and known and studied, women, all women's situations, were very caring. They really made a surrogate kind of family and protected each other, and when possible would remember a birthday at Ravensbrück. There are all kinds of beautiful little gifts that were made one to the other that you can see them. You can see them in the Ravensbrück exhibit now. And so women as women, I think that it's important to, as a subject, it's what we're working on, and I really don't want to, you can ask questions later. I think my time is about up. And the last thing I want to say is I know that Marisa's going to talk more about this, so maybe it's a good segue, but one of the prime examples of women's experiences being left out, I mentioned forced prostitution. According to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, which I asked, and they say they don't know where they got the number from, which is a little strange. Now she's going to say American Jewish history
does not reflect AJHS.
No, they didn't remember where they got the number. They said there were 500 brothels in the Nazi concentration camp system. So I wrote to the man who published the study and said, very interesting, where'd you get this from? And they don't know. But there were hundreds anyhow. And so it's an important issue, and it's kind of forgotten in Auschwitz during the memorialization there, that the barrack number 24 that you walk by right after you go through the sign was a brothel, and they don't want to talk about it there either. So I think that's basically what I wanted to say, and the bravery of the 4 women in this exhibit is, an example of something else I didn't mention, which was women in the resistance, and they were there in various capacities, and we need to remember that too. So I think the rest will be in questions. Okay?
Thank you very much. Your comment about the rape document reminds me of when the claims conference started to offer reparations payments, and I remember working at the LA Holocaust Museum, and survivors, the print was about this big in English, which in some cases was maybe a 5th or 6th language, and it was about this thick, the paperwork that the survivor had to fill out to get their Article 2 money. And one of the questions was that you had to have your original birth certificate. And I remember the survivors lining up outside my office, because when you do paperwork for one, you have to do paperwork for all, of course. And so they would come and say to me, but I don't have my original birth certificate. And I would say, I understand, no Holocaust survivor has their original birth certificate. And I very nicely wrote Gideon a letter saying, this is absurd, and they changed it. But it took about a year. So I would love to shift focus a little bit to you, Marisa, to talk about these kinds of hidden truths and experiences, whether it was fear or shame or guilt, survivor guilt, or any of these issues. And also maybe if you could comment, which Rochelle a little bit hinted at in her very graceful way, about sort of the fields of journalism and academia, and how these fields have been male-dominated for many, many years, and sort of how women are treated in these fields, as a whole anyway. And I think Elisa could comment about that as well.
So I'll speak, is this on? Yeah. Okay. So I'll speak a little bit about my experiences, which, are probably very extreme. Growing up, I knew that my mother was from Poland, and I knew that my grandmother died in Auschwitz, but the narrative that my mother crafted about herself and how she survived was a myth, was total fiction. And my mother did so to conceal a few things. One of the first piece of it was that I discovered that my mother had been a love child, so there was the great shanda of being, a mamzer. which I guess was a legacy she didn't want to pass on to me and to my children, because according to the Jewish religion, it's now it's a curse for perpetuity. What's that? Oh, sure. Sorry. And then the other piece of it was that my mother had been a Holocaust survivor. My mother, I knew that my mother told me that she had escaped Poland on a boat for children. She had basically changed her name and changed her age. She made herself a decade younger than she was, and said that she was a little girl and she escaped on a boat to Palestine, and her father had been a Zionist. And that part was true, her father just wasn't married to my grandmother. And my mother actually, it was true that she joined up with him, but when she got to Palestine, she had no idea that she had a father, and she had no idea of her origins. She had no idea that she was a love child, because my grandmother's husband died right after my mother was born. So my mother was shielded from the truth as well. So when she got to Palestine, she joined Lehi, which was one of the most radical of the Israeli underground groups, and then fought in the Israeli army and was very passionate about the state of Israel. And when she came to this country after her father died, through her father's brother, who had already moved to New York, all she wanted to talk about was that she had been a freedom fighter in Israel, and that was it. She concealed that she had been a love child. She used her biological father's name, changed her name when she came to this country, and just buried that past. And it was only through the slip of a tongue of an elderly relative, like 5-6 years ago, that I got the first inkling of the truth. And I knew that my mother has been dead now 21 years, and I knew that she was lying. I knew that there was there were so many holes in her narratives. And whenever I grilled her growing up, she always dodged the truth. And I think that, living like that probably in some weird way compelled me to be a journalist, because all I ever really wanted was the truth and clarity, and an atmosphere that welcomed questions, because every question I ever had growing up was met with silence and you'll never understand and you won't be able to handle it, which is sort of an awful way to grow up. So when I got this first inkling, I was like, wow, I can't believe it. So I decided to go to Poland, and what you said about survivors having to show up with birth records. So everybody on my tour, I went on a heritage tour of my mother's part of Poland, which is Zagłębia, and I was the only American. They were all Israelis, and they all came with documents from their parents and birth records and passports, and I was like, I think this was her name. I think this is the year that she was born. It took some doing to find her birth record, but once I found it, it was just the beginning. And I'm still finding people. The other day, a woman found me on LinkedIn, of all places. Second generation, her mother, who's still alive, was in my mother's camp, so I have yet to interview her. But uncovering my mother's story, of course, the big question is why? Why did women conceal their stories? And this has really sort of changed me. And kind of compelled me to help share their stories, because so much of what we know of Holocaust history has been framed by men. And the more women I interview to just sort of get a glimpse of my mother's life, the more I realize just how little we really know about women and what they did to survive. I think a lot of the reason why a lot of women didn't talk about it, just from the interviews I've done, has been, of course, survivor's guilt, this tremendous amount of shame. Why was I the only one spared? A lot of the women told me about, there were 2 times where they would cry during my interviews that were just very predictable, when they would tell me about the last time they saw their mother, when they were being taken away to a labor camp or something, and then when they would talk about going back home and realizing that everyone was gone, and that there was somebody living in their home who said, "Why are you here? We thought the Nazis had killed you all." So you can understand why they just never wanted to revisit that part of their life. and which just further solidified that, there was great, why was I spared, and let's just carry on. I think a lot of them also overcame huge obstacles. I mean, one thing I learned about my mother was, by the time she came to this country, all the countries that she had passed through. She was born in Poland. Her camp was in the Czech Republic. She learned German and Yiddish, although she was very, rigid about, we don't speak Yiddish at home. It's the old language, we speak Hebrew. And that was very much part of her, the doctrine of Lehi, the Stern group that she was in. They believed in Hebrew as the national language. So my mother spoke Polish, German. She picked up French also. She picked up Italian because she went to a refugee camp after the war in Modena, and she got on an Italian, a boat from Italy to get to Palestine. It was a fishing boat named the Enzo Sereni. And then in Israel, she had to learn Hebrew. So by the time she came to this country, like, English was like her sixth language. So, they got here, they wanted to function. My mother came here with a specific purpose of going to college, and she wanted to be a doctor, which she was never able to achieve. And I just think it's remarkable that, by the time she came here, she was 30. When the war broke out, she was 13. So there was a huge gap in her education, and that she was even able to get into Albert Einstein Medical School and complete a couple of years is amazing to me. And it just saddens me that she was so ashamed of that she never became a doctor. And also finding this camp diary that she wrote in and reading about these girls there's 60 women wrote in this diary, and they were teenagers. And they expressed such a variety of voices. On the one hand, it's a little vulgar. They rewrote the Polish alphabet with each letter standing for a different aspect of their camp life, and they weren't afraid to swear and, be a little frank and graphic. They also wrote radio skits in which, they kind of parodied sort of like SNL skits about their camp life, so they never lost their sense of humor and their sense of identity, which is remarkable to me. And it's just sad that they came to this country and they just felt that they couldn't talk about it. There's a woman in my building who I've become close with who's a survivor, who I've talked with a lot, and she told me that when she came here, and she was the only one in her family, she stayed with extended relatives, and they treated her, with such mistrust. They were always checking the refrigerator to make sure she wasn't stealing food. So she couldn't wait to move out. And she got a job at a jewelry company and was very good at designing. So she saved up her money so she could live on her own, but it wasn't proper for a Jewish woman to live on her own before she was married, so she had a roommate. And she saved up enough money to go on vacation, and she went to, like, not the Catskills, but some Jewish resort, like in Lake George or something, and she was gorgeous. She showed me pictures of herself. And all these women, all the young eligible guys would come around and ask her for a date. And by the time but they never got to second date, because all of them said, my mother told me I can't date you, or they won't send me to medical school or law school. And she said we were treated like damaged goods. And this is something I've heard time and time again when a woman would say she was a survivor. Especially in Israel, and I know that's a separate topic, which is what my mother even confirmed. They were met with, what did you do to survive if you were a woman? Looked upon with great suspicion, were you a Nazi whore? What did you do? Or, you think you're so great, you cheated, you swindled, you're here because someone else died in your place. And because a lot of people did have to change their identity, they assumed Gentile identities to survive. I think there was a great sense of feeling fraudulent deep inside, and that, I think, further compounded their sense of shame. And then, of course, if they had been raped, how do you begin to talk about that? This is a whole separate conversation, and I'm happy to stop now, but, what the Shoah Foundation did was amazing, getting a lot of these women for the first time to talk about it. But unfortunately, a lot of these women had their families with them. And one of the greatest accomplishments for a Jewish woman after the war was to reproduce, was to have a family, get married, and to show Hitler didn't win. Look, I have I mean, I remember growing up, and my parents would always say, you have to have at least 3 kids. Well, check, but wasn't intentional. But, you know, the sense of we all have an obligation to repopulate the earth, and it was a big burden to women. So let's say a woman was sitting there with her children or a son. How is she supposed to say, and then I was a slave? I was a sex slave for the Nazis. I mean, so I still think, even though we have amazing testimony, we still don't have enough. So I'll end there.
Thank you very much. I want to sort of just piggyback on that and talk about the reluctant heroine, the reluctant teller of the truth, which I found, you know, I probably watched 3,000 testimonies in my time at the Shoah Foundation in 3 different languages, and that was a real repetitive theme, which was this is the story. Yes, I will tell you this story. I did this, and my sister did this, and my mother did this. But what I really want to talk about is my granddaughter, because you know that's the news now, and they wanted to. You know, I remember vividly a woman who told the most horrific story I had ever heard to date, and sort of breezed through it. You know, she was like, she said, I know this is my moral obligation to tell my story, so I'm going to tell it. And it was completely disconnected. And the interviewer was fantastic and asked open-ended questions. And the survivor responded, you know, very much in kind, but it was a real disconnect. And she openly wept the only time where she said, and Baruch Hashem, I had 7 sons. And Baruch Hashem, they all married Beis Yaakov girls. Thank God. And it was, she openly just wept. And the interviewer actually says to her, I'm, you know, this makes you very emotional. And she said, oh yes, this makes me very emotional. And he said, but the story you told me about your sister, you told very calmly. And she said, that's not my story, it's hers. I'm just obligated to tell it. So there was a lot of that kind of reluctance, and I think that really translates into kind of the meta-narrative, which I want to talk to you about a little bit, because I know you've done quite a bit of work as sort of women in genocide as a whole, and how these stories and the stories of the women in the exhibit really, unfortunately, have a lot of resonance today and in many other instances of genocide.
Yeah, thank you. I think one of the, I don't, although I did do some work on the Holocaust for my dissertation, women and the Holocaust is not my specialty, so I will be talking about other genocides particularly. But I think one of the things that's important to point out when we're thinking about doing research on women in genocide and more generally is that research on women often changes the meta-narrative. We're not just adding women, right? We're not just adding women's stories, and we're not simply filling out the picture so that we have a better rounded view of the past, although we get that as well when we do this research. But frequently, when we begin to do research on women's experiences during the Holocaust, during genocide, we begin to see the crime differently, right? Or the patterns change. New things come to light. The behavior of men can be addressed or analyzed in a new way, right? So it's very important that we do this research not simply, right, to bring to light the history of women, right, which is over 50% of the world population and therefore needs to be told, but also because it changes our view of history, right? And from the point of view of genocide studies, I think there's several things that have emerged now that women's histories or women's experiences are being talked about more openly and researched more intensively, right? So I'll list a couple of them. One is that we've begun to recognize patterns that are useful to genocide prevention, to early warning systems, that if you were simply looking at men, you wouldn't necessarily see, right? So these are gender-specific patterns that are red flags to the presence of a genocidal violence and genocidal logic. For example, when you look at what's happening to the Yazidi peoples, right, today, who are being attacked, as we all know, by ISIS, right? If you were simply looking at the experiences of men or highlighting the experiences of men, male Yazidis, who are frequently murdered outright, right, by ISIS, one could easily say, well, this is terrible, it's communal violence or massacre, war crimes, crimes against humanity, right? Certainly all of those. But when you begin to look at the concomitant existence of the murder and massacre of men, right, and the kidnapping of women, right, and the sexual enslavement of women and girls, then you see a clearly genocidal pattern in the works, right? Given that genocide is about the destruction of a group in whole or in part, right? And this brings me to another insight that feminist scholarship and gender-based scholarship and scholarship on women has brought to light, which is the extent to which, when we begin to look at women's experiences, right, not only do we see these separate patterns, but also we see that genocide itself is a crime that's very much preoccupied with reproduction, right, with destroying the ability of a group to reproduce itself into the future on many levels. On one level, there's the biological level, right, which means simply biological reproduction of members of the group. And of course, then, women are going to be prime targets of genocide because it is women who bring new people, new members of the group into the world. And so you'll see patterns in genocides, right, that are very much focused on destroying that life-giving capacity. Sexual violence is one of those patterns, right? Sexual violence has, of course, mental and physical sequelae that make it very difficult for people to bring, or often can make it difficult for people to bring new children, new members of the group into the world. Furthermore, you have that biological aspect, right? You'll see targeted cruelties against pregnant women, right? So the evisceration of pregnant women. This is across the board, across time, right? And across various cultures, this is a common form of cruelty against women, or cruelty against a group. It's a common pattern in genocide, is to target pregnant women. And then also children, right, as symbols of the group's future. And so you find clustered around women's experiences all of these cruelties that were left out of the definition of genocide, right? And then our approach to genocide since Raphael Lemkin coined the term in 1943, 1944. So we have a new view of genocide, in a sense, one that engages much more strongly and more directly this issue of the destruction of the reproductive capacity of a group, right? Now, there are other levels on which this can happen as well, more institutional levels. We often call that cultural genocide, and there's a distinction made between cultural genocide, which is the destruction of religious institutions, national libraries, artifacts, right? Important sites of pilgrimage. And we make a distinction between cultural genocide and then physical genocide, real genocide, right? But you'll find that when you begin to look at the experience of women, right, that it's hard to make that clear distinction between cultural and physical genocide, because what we see when we look at women is that genocidal violence is extremely symbolic, right? And so you're destroying women's capacity to reproduce, right, while also destroying the group's capacity to reproduce itself on a larger, more public level, right? So it's women's experiences during genocide have called that to attention as well, and have questioned this separation between cultural genocide, which is considered not real genocide, right, and physical genocide, which is considered to conform more closely to the legal definition of genocide, right? It's interesting to note, and this goes back to the question of the meta-narrative, right? It's interesting to note that Raphael Lemkin himself, who, as many of you know, was sort of the father of the Genocide Convention, right, that was passed in 1948 by the UN, which is our legal instrument, right, for addressing the problem of genocide, and which also set out what's considered to be the legal definition, but is often used also as the sort of scholarly definition of genocide. Raphael Lemkin himself was working in his life on a history of genocide that many of his archival documents are here, actually. And this was never published, right? But in his notes, because he died too early, he died at age 59, so he died before he could finish this, I think it was a 3-volume book was planned. In his notes, sexual violence is ever present, right? For every case he looked at, and he was really wide-ranging in the cases he looked at, right? He developed his definition of genocide around the Holocaust, right? Although even before, and he developed the definition in a book on the Holocaust, written before the end of the Holocaust in 1943, 1944, called Axis Rule in Occupied Europe. It's a brilliant book. And there he defines genocide and tries to base it on this text that he has just written, right, in order to make a stronger case for the term and the importance of creating a legal mechanism to prosecute this. But he had been interested in this very question of how do we prosecute genocide, how do we prevent genocide, since after World War I, when he asked the question about the Armenian genocide, why is it a crime to kill one man, right? For me to kill one man, but for a state, and it's not a crime for a state to kill over 1 million human beings, right? He asked that question, so he was interested in the Armenian genocide, he was interested in the Assyrian genocide in the 1930s in Iraq. So even before writing this seminal work on the Holocaust, he had looked at other cases. And then when he came to write down his notes and develop this 3-volume work of his on the history of genocide, it's interesting to note that sexual violence was there, and it raises the question, why was sexual violence not enumerated directly in his legal definition of the crime, right? In the legal definition he proposed, and then the legal definition that was agreed upon by the various states at the UN. He was very nuanced in his approach to genocide, and he included things like the separation of sexes as a sign of genocide, right, as evidence of genocide, the kidnapping or the transfer of children from one group to another group, inflicting conditions of physical or mental harm, right? And these are some of the elements of genocide that international jurists now use to argue that things like mass rape during the Bosnian genocide or things like mass rape during the Rwandan genocide are actually acts of genocide, right? That they're crimes of genocide, not some other kind of crime that happened while a genocide was happening, right? But a constitutive element of that crime as it was expressed in Bosnia and Rwanda. And I think in a way, Raphael Lemkin didn't know what to do with sexualized violence, right? He wrote extensively about it and recognized its importance, particularly during the Armenian genocide. But how do you conceptualize it, right? There weren't easy ways to conceptualize it at the time, especially in international law, which was a man's game, right? And I think, we have to think about this in that larger framework where women for so long, if you look at the development of the modern field of historical studies, right, it really came into its own in the 19th century, and this was a time when women were seen to occupy an unchanging, natural, domestic space, right, that was separate from the wider currents of history, that was sort of ahistorical, it was cyclical, right? And it followed its own patterns and its own cadences. And so, in a way, it was uninteresting, right? And as well, at that time, almost everybody was uninteresting, right? It was the state and the great men who were interesting to historians. And slowly, right, the interest has broadened, thank goodness, and we're still working on that. But this issue of sexualized violence, right, and its presence in Raphael Lemkin's writings show how important, but its absence from the legal definition of genocide, its absence from so much scholarship on genocide up until really recently, its absence from people's common understandings of this crime, genocide, shows how important it is, right, that women are integrated into the meta-narrative, how much we miss out on, right, and how we can really fundamentally misunderstand a crime if we're not looking at it holistically, right, and if we don't, in fact, bring that supposedly ahistorical female realm, right, of the domestic sphere, which is, of course, an idealization, right? It doesn't exist. Women have worked throughout history. Women have been a part of the public, right? But this was the idea. If we don't bring that, if we don't kind of, bust open that category, right, and bring that category into public history and see it as part of this larger history of the state, of international law, right? If we don't do that, we risk misunderstanding our past, right, and misunderstanding and responding inappropriately to similar events as they unfold in the present day.
Thank you very much. I want to point out that we here at AJHS are the keepers of Raphael Lemkin's papers, and they're here.
Yeah.
We have a reading room. You're welcome to see them. And it's quite a remarkable collection, actually, and it's one of our most utilized collections. And he had a hell of a time passing it as it was.
As it was.
I don't know how he could have possibly added, but I think that opens up one sort of final point that I want to raise about the respective fields that are represented on the stage, whether it's journalism or the academy or nonprofit, or archival work, which is that, when you said it was a man's game, I mean, women weren't really, when were women welcomed into the academy, right? I mean, about the 70s, there were women PhDs before that, but they were largely not in social sciences and history. They were in chemistry or in biology or, things of that nature. And I just wondered, if you could each briefly comment. I'm sure any woman who has worked on a PhD would have volumes to say about this, at least in my experience. I won't comment. But I just wondered, it really, I think if part of that story is because there sort of were no women in positions to do that work. And I also wonder how many women, when they brought their projects to their advisors, were told, oh, that's not a good project. That's not a good subject for you.
Well, I cannot personally complain. I got my doctorate in political science very late, and my two advisors, really, I have to say, of blessed memory, and they were about my age because I was not a baby, were men, and they were supportive, and I can't say anything bad about it. My original idea was to do my doctorate on Ravensbrück, and I didn't do it on that, on the good advice of my advisor, who said, that's ridiculous, it's in Germany, you really can't read German, and you really need to do something that you'll be able to do easier. And I did my dissertation on the politics behind the creation of the New York City Holocaust Museum and the politics of memory, and it's probably the best advice anybody could have given me. However, I live here. I live in Israel. I live part of the time in Brazil. My husband is a Brazilian academic. And I don't know the statistics. I didn't know you were going to ask this question. But in Israel, there are always articles in the newspaper about that, yes, there are women in the academy, but they're not getting to the higher levels, that there's, as the statistics of women to men in the higher levels of departments is not a good balance. And the same is true in a lot of the disciplines in Brazil. And to tell the truth, I know more about those two countries with academia, and you probably know more about it here. But, so, I mean, there's good news and bad news. Yes, there's women in academia now, but there still seems to be some discrimination as far as rising, and particularly in certain, not in the social sciences so much, but more in the hard sciences, math, engineering. My God, my husband well, I'm trying to, I don't know, he's in his 60s, so whenever he was in undergraduate school in University of Sao Paulo, which is one of the best universities in South America, he was in engineering school, there was one girl or young woman, and they nicknamed her the little rat in Portuguese, you know. I mean, so I think we've come quite a ways from that. He always tells that story, you know, like they didn't know what to do with her. I mean, she just didn't belong with all these guys. It wasn't so long ago, but it was long enough ago that that doesn't happen now, so.
I mean, I can't speak about academia, but I can share a little tidbit. I interviewed Rochelle over the summer. We've been in touch for a little while now, and she always has great stories for me. But I wrote a story over the summer about the politics of Holocaust history, which was basically predicated by the news that The Hague was opening a tribunal, an international tribunal, to look into, to investigate and prosecute perpetrators of sex crimes during war and genocide, and that these crimes were now going to be classified as war crimes. One of the classifications for sex crime was forced nudity, which just about any survivor, anybody who had walked through the gates of a concentration camp or a labor camp had been subjected to. So it prompted me to sort of do this article on, you know, every country is now opening up, is being open to looking into sex crimes, you know, Rwanda, Bosnia, you know, there's been a lot of information about the rape of women in genocide, except for the Holocaust, and why is that? So when I was interviewing Rochelle, one of the things she told me was, you know, when I went on a tour of Auschwitz, during the tour, you know, we were shown just about everything, and I finally said to the tour guide, why aren't you going to show us, when are we going to see the brothel? And he said, oh, we don't show the brothel. So
it was a woman, not a he.
Oh, was it she? Okay. So I was in Poland over the summer, and I thought, well, I want to find out why they don't show the brothel. So I took a meeting with the director of research at Auschwitz, and I was treated first with a lot of derision. You know, basically he said, oh, every few years we get a journalist looking for a salacious angle, and the brothel always comes up. You know, they want a sexy angle for their stories. And I said, if you think I find the topic of sexual slavery sexy, you've got to be kidding me, and you certainly need an education yourself on the nature of sexual violence. And I said, and let's not even call it a brothel, because it was, you know, sexual slavery. And he finally agreed, and he was very firm that there were no Jewish women there. And I said, how do you know? And he goes, because I have the list of prisoners. And I said, oh, you have the list. And I said, can I see the list? And he goes, yes, but you can't keep it. He said, you see, they're all Gentile names. And I said, well, I'm sure you're aware that Jewish women faked their identities to survive during the Holocaust. And he said, well, there weren't so many, and anyway, they were vetted. And I said, they were vetted? I said, there was no genetic testing back then. How, you know, there was no way to prove that they were Jewish or not.
He actually used the word vetted?
Yeah, I mean, his English was okay, but yeah, he used something like vetted or examined.
I know who you're talking about. His English is fine.
His English, yeah. I mean, he used examined. You know, they were checked. They were checked to make sure they weren't Jewish, as if there had been DNA testing at the time. And then he, and then I said, well, where does all your information come from? And he goes, well, we have records that the SS kept. They were very meticulous, and he showed me the floor plan of the brothel. He talked about it. He talked about how the place was arranged. He talked about the conditions. He talked about, basically he just kept on talking. And I said, excuse me, do you have any testimony from women? No, we don't. And then he relayed the story about, a few years ago they had a woman come by who wanted to submit some testimony or who wanted to look up something. And they always have people fill out a questionnaire. And one of the items is, were you a prisoner here? If so, what was your number? And what was your job? And so she put down her number, and sure enough, it matched one of the brothel workers, or one of the sex slaves. And under what she did, she wrote, I did what I could do. And they totally missed that opportunity. They decided they weren't going to press her. They weren't going to ask her any questions. And I said, I thought you were committed to history. I thought you were committed to coming up with a comprehensive picture of this place, and all you're going on are, the men who used these women to come up with your narrative of this place, of the nature of sexual slavery. And he kind of acknowledged that was a problem. And I said, well, why won't you talk about it? I said, this is a prime opportunity for you to... Then he said something like, well, we have lots of teenage kids coming through here. Teenage kids, a lot of them from Israel, and, they just sort of start joking around at that point and saying, oh, let's talk about the brothel. And I said, well, isn't that the perfect opportunity to, and they're at the perfect age to explain the difference between sexual violence and sexual respect, and having a mutually consensual relationship with somebody. He goes, well, anyway, we have very limited time, and we also have foreigners from other countries like Korea. And I said, Korea? Perfect. The comfort women. They would really get it. Long story short, I sat there with him for 3-4 hours, and I think Rochelle and I are going to try to change his mind and try to get them to try to incorporate more female narratives, not just about the brothel, but also about sterilization and the multitude of experiences, the housekeepers that the SS kept that were basically sex slaves, documented in books and memoirs, even in Schindler's List. There were so many other episodes, women raped female prisoners, and he finally started to crack a little bit when I said, well, why were there men on the women's side? And he said, well, yeah, you're probably right. But, I just couldn't believe the lack of respect and how little women's narratives count at a major place like Auschwitz. It just blew my mind.
Can I just say something about another major place, which is Yad Vashem, which Rachel has nothing to do with my complaint. And last year there was another teacher seminar scheduled for the summer, so I wrote to the head of the education department, and I said, don't you think it's time to do a plenary session on sexual violence during the Holocaust? And my colleague and I would be glad to do that for you. I think it's really important for the teachers. And he wrote me back and said, and this part of it is a direct quote, surely you will agree with me, which I don't, that sexual violence is not an appropriate subject for junior high school and high school teachers to deal with. Okay? Anyhow, we know that there are sex education classes in the public schools, et cetera, and so forth. And so this attitude, which is similar to the one that you found in Auschwitz, it's hard to understand and hard to fight, and we're fighting.
I don't know if you had anything to add about the academy, or maybe you don't want to, but I don't want to put you on the spot. Briefly.
No, I mean, women still face huge issues in the academy. I, too, can't complain, right? I had many male supporters in the academy as well as female supporters while I was there. But I think a lot of it revolves around Labor issues, do you know women are disproportionately represented amongst adjunct and temporary faculty, for example, right? Issues of child rearing. So there are things like that that mirror problems in the wider labor market that I think are some of the major issues that we now face. And, you know, and that's important in terms of the type of scholarship that is produced, because, you know, as has been said, the more women are writing, the more, right, there may be an understanding that the brothel at Auschwitz is an important subject, right? And it won't be so easily dismissed, right, as women advance into positions of decision-making power. You know, it's similar in international law. One of the reasons that we now talk about sexualized violence as a crime of war, as a crime against humanity, and as a crime of genocide is because women jurists, right, women legal scholars, international feminists pressed the issue. Samantha Power, right, pressed the issue when these ad hoc tribunals were set up around the crimes committed in Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia, and Rwanda. Those tribunals were not going to try sexualized violence, right, at all. And it was women who forced the issue. And so women we've seen that, right, that women do need to be in positions of decision-making power in order to bring attention to this crime, right, and then to other issues, right, of what is appropriate material, right, when it comes to the education of younger people about genocide. That mirrors, you know, just in short, it does mirror the debates that are occurring on college campuses about discussing sexualized violence, where, you know, college campuses are inheriting the problems produced by precisely that attitude, right, that junior high school children are too young to engage in a discussion about appropriate and inappropriate sexual behavior, right? And the question of sexualized violence. And so by the time students get to college, many of them, the girls included, have no idea, right, about no clear concept of what respectful, right, sexual activity is as opposed to sexual violence. And now colleges have to face this, and of course they don't want to for myriad reasons, right? But I think this is a good example where that sort of education earlier on is precisely what we need, right, in order to create a society in which sexualized violence against women is not such a common thing, right, and is not so extensive.
Thank you. I do want to open this up for questions, but before I do, I want to introduce someone very special. Ariella Heilman, of course, but I wonder if you want to come up here. Come. Please come. I didn't mean that to sound like an order. Ariella is the niece of Esther Voxblom. And her mother, Anna Heilman, who I didn't share with you, but I spoke with her on the telephone over the period of several months in preparation for her testimonial that she gave to the Show Foundation.
Wow.
And I was so struck by how much you resemble her when I first met you. So, but I just wondered, you know, if you wanted to comment a bit on what you heard tonight or the exhibit. Or any, yeah, please.
Okay.
Thank you.
Right. Thank you. I didn't know about this until yesterday when Ann Kirshner, who edited Salah's letters, I don't know if any of you are familiar with that book, or was a book that she is traveling around the world with, and her mother was also a survivor, and spoke to Marisa Fox for the first time this morning. The question that she asked me and what I would like to address, my mother wrote a memoir. This is my daughter. This is the third generation. Someone asked about where can they read about the story of the four women. This is my mother's Auschwitz memoir, and she writes about it. It's never far away. Getting the book is not so straightforward, but Sheldon Schwartz, my brother-in-law, sells them. He got the book done. He made my mother write the book. So Marisa's question was, how did the book come around to be written? My mother's camp sister, Marta Bindiger, her daughter's here from Brussels, just coincidentally, another woman in my life, and another woman who can bear witness as what I just spoke to my daughter about today. We're like the first responders. You think about 9/11, the children of the survivors are the first responders. We are the witnesses to the horror that they lived. And the way the book came around and came about was Marta's mother came to Canada, where my mother lived, from Brussels, where she lived, somewhere in the early 1980s, and said, you have a responsibility to history to set the record straight. Rosa Robota's story was written right after the war in 1945. Her town, and I'm sorry I don't remember the name of the town, made the story known that there were women and there was resistance, and she was involved. There were 4 women hanged publicly less than 2 weeks before the liberation. 2 for the day shift and 2 for the night shift. So everyone would be a witness to what happens if you don't toe the line. And Marta said to my mother, she was the best friend of Estusha, whose name is on the wall in the exhibit. And among the last conversations they had were that Marta's job would be to take care of the baby, my mother. Part of taking care of my mother was this visit in the 80s and saying, lady, history has to be set straight. It's your job. And it became my mother's retirement. The last quarter of her life she spent in getting the monument to the 4 women erected in Auschwitz, getting her diary in Polish translated into English. My brother-in-law from Saskatchewan, by fax, mail, and snail mail and telephone before email, saying, you know, it's a good translation, but the story needs a context. It needs a beginning, it needs an end. And he pulled that story out of her, kicking and screaming, over the course of 7 or 8 years. And the result is, you know, thankfully, this book and this chronicle. And that's what I have to say.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. In the research I did from Laura Shelley's first-person testimonies, I did my best, and including your mother, of course, and including Marta, of course, the 4 women who were hanged were not by any means the only women who were part of this wonderful resistance. And we named about 8 or so others, including your mother's, and I'm sure there are other names that I didn't know, and maybe they're even in that book and can be added, so that the 4 are, you know, we're also remembering all of the other very brave women as well. Thank you so much.
Does anyone have any questions? Okay, I'm going to start. I'll start here.
Hi, should I stand up? Or no. I'm Heather Dune McAdam, Rochelle, and I am the author of Rena's Promise, A Story of Sisters in Auschwitz, and I have a question.
The author
I have
of
a
what?
question for the audience and everybody here.
What is you author of? I didn't.
Rena's Promise.
Rena's Promise.
Hi. Yeah.
Oh, hi.
Hi, how are you? I would like to know how many people in the audience and on our panel know that the first Jewish transport, mass transport to Auschwitz, was all young women. 1, 2, 3.
Well, yeah. I didn't raise my hand.
So we have more in this history, and the 70th anniversary of the first transport was March 26, 2012, and I could not get the United States Holocaust Museum to put something about it on the website. I could not get, I had an argument with the director of the Viner Library, who said it wasn't the first transport, which is what it was called in 1995 when I first wrote the book. They changed it to the first mass registered transport. my question is, this is my theory, I think the men are jealous. That, you know, Carol Rittner and John Roth wrote in different voices that 62% more women died in the Holocaust than men. And so how do we write ourselves into history when we can't even get Yad Vashem and some of these, you know, huge, huge places to honor the fact that the first Jews in Auschwitz were all young girls? And that's genocide.
Oh, absolutely.
How did you find out?
Hi, I have a question for the panel. I'm not Jewish, obviously, but I do come from India, where sexual violence against women is endemic, systemic, institutionalized, culturally integrated into everything that happens in India. However, having said that, there are also subjective first-person narratives that have come out of India that used to be called subaltern narratives, which were, you know, first put forward by Spivak. Subaltern narratives that were first put forward by Spivak, and which includes Mashweta Devi and so on and so forth. But that has remained at that level. It has only become integrated into academia when it steps out of that location. It is less accepted in India to talk about these things than it is outside. So there is a certain value to an outsider perspective outside of that location. Having said that, in this location, and, you know, hearing you talk about institutions and the failure of institutions to recognize these stories, what is the sense of, or what is the turning point or the lynch around which this institutionalized failure of representation turns?
Well, you know, I would be more than willing to guess that all of the institutions I've complained about, and then some more, would tell you how wonderfully they have treated, you know, the story of women during the Holocaust and presenting it, which is kind of a subtle difference because, well, because they haven't, but they maybe want to say they think they have. Again, I'm not picking on Yad Vashem, but they did. I'm just very familiar with it, okay? They did a traveling show called, I think, A Spot of Light or some, what? Spots of Light,
right.
about women. And hey, we did something about women. But truthfully, please don't quote me. I think there's a couple of journalists here. This is not for attribution, but it could have been better. It's, you know, so then they can say, hey, we did something about women. But, you know,
yeah,
that's part of the problem.
I was going to answer your question also by saying I feel your frustration, and it's incredibly difficult. And I came back from that meeting at Auschwitz and immediately called up Rochelle, and we're trying to draft some sort of a proposal. Thank you. Because it's truly criminal, and I don't think so much it's a matter of men are jealous. I think men are. I think a lot of the men were ashamed that they weren't protecting their women enough. I think also getting back to my mother's secrecy, the Jewish religion has so much shame attached to, you know, being a bastard child. And oh my gosh, what if, you know, some woman's child, like there were so many children that were born in DP camps immediately after the Holocaust. Well, what if it were found out that one of them was really the child of a Nazi? So,
and some were. And
some were, right? And on top of it all, you know, just the shame of rape. You know, another thing that Rochelle opened my eyes to, which is, you know, in the classification of sexual violence during war and genocide, you know, a lot of women, one of the stories that emerged from my mother's camp was that the camp was relatively, like, you know, one of the survivors said, I thought I was in hell during the whole time, but when we were liberated and we heard about the other camps, we realized we had been in heaven. A lot of the women attributed their survival to the fact that there were 50 POWs at the camp who received regular packages from the Red Cross, and they shared their food, but it wasn't sharing the food. It was, you know, a lot of trading of sexual favors, and there was a lot of activity that a lot of the women reported on to me going on in the bathrooms. And women blame themselves. I mean, if rape victims today don't report on rape because the victims are put on trial and the burden of proof is on the women. Imagine back then when there was so little understanding of rape and sexual coercion, they blamed themselves, and then they thought of themselves as dirty, and they thought that they were low because they dared to accept food, trade sexual favors for food. So
also, the first transports did gynecological exams on all girls. That was the first thing they did.
I also just wanted to add one other thing, which is if you go to Europe, and have anyone of you been to any of the Holocaust memorials in Europe, particularly in Western Europe? The subject of resistance just isn't, it's not there. It's gone. They don't talk about it. It's not there. It's not on display. And I actually asked one of my very august, very esteemed colleagues about this, and God bless him. His response to me was, well, we don't have it here because if there was more resistance, we wouldn't have a history to write about. Wow. And this is a very well-known, prominent historian. If you were in the field and I told you his name, which I will never do, you would know who I was talking about.
I just want to add one thing. You were asking about around what does this exclusion pivot from an institutional standpoint? And perhaps that was a little lacking from what we were discussing, in a sense that there's, it's power structures, right, that are both, they can be ideological on the one hand, but they can also be internalized and very subtle. And so the sort of belief that women's history isn't that important can be held by people who are genuinely wonderful human beings.
That's right.
Right? But they just don't see the point. What are you talking about? Why would we have a memorial? But then there are also very strong power structures that subaltern studies, right, or that the history of mass sexualized violence directly target. Right? You can't write about or think about or research mass sexual violence, right, without targeting deeply ingrained patriarchal power structures and norms. You just can't do it. And even if you don't state it outright, it's implied and everyone gets the point. To stop this, right, the structures have to change. So I would say that there's an issue of power, right, around which that.
I agree with that, but there's also an issue of language and the definition.
Mm-hmm.
When you talked about the legal definition of genocide versus
Yeah.
the written version of genocide, there are two different language constructions right
Absolutely.
there. Having said that, part of maybe moving forward or reconsidering just even the language would be to maybe talk about genocide versus human rights and how that parlays into each other, where it's human rights, it's not women's rights, it's not men's rights. But that distinction itself, making that distinction itself has a very slippery slope. So how do you integrate women's rights into human rights without disservice to both?
Both. Yeah, that's a big question.
That's a big question. There was a slogan at some point, women's rights are human rights, but it's easier said than done. Yeah.
Are crimes against humanity.
Right.
Exactly.
Hi, I'm curious about a couple of things that Dr. Saidel mentioned and others, and that is I became interested in Abba Kovner in regard to Bricha, which helped save my life. Bricha is a rescue organization that he and others founded to help Jews get out of Soviet Union, Germany, whatever. Anyhow, I discovered when I came to a lecture here, I asked how Abba Kovner is treated in Israel. Is he treated as a hero? And this is one person's comment, and they said, not really that much. He's known as a poet, but somehow Holocaust heroes aren't really that much in Israel. They're kind of not looked down upon, but there's some element of diminishing them. Anyhow, I learned about the two women who I know most about, who were heroines, who helped blow up, the first German rail lines and stuff. And I'm wondering whether the Yad Vashem comments that you made don't reflect something about, my question is, are those two women recognized in Israel? Korshak is her name, one of them, and one of them he married. I've forgotten their names. So are they treated as
Wait,
heroines?
one of them he married?
He married one of them.
Abba Kovner. That's
right.
Wittke,
Yes.
Kempner, right? Yeah.
Victor Kempner, and yes. And he was very close with both of them during the war. So are they treated as heroines? Are they recognized? Is anyone who's a Holocaust hero treated with great respect? Does Yad Vashem reflect that in some way?
You're looking at me. I don't know. I don't think there's any. I think that Wittke is more remembered at Lo Hamei HaGhetto.
Lo Hamei HaGhetto, yeah, she's there.
Than at Yad Vashem. I'm working on another project, which to me is a wonderful, great heroine who I'm in love with, who is Haviva Reich, and she's really hardly remembered in Israel. And she was one of the parachutists who, during British Mandate, parachuted into Slovakia and was an amazing heroine. And, you know, I ask young people in Israel today and they go, who? Hannah Senesh is more known because of her writing, but when the kids or even older people sing Eli, Eli, walking to Caesarea, that's a famous song in Israel, but very few people know Hannah Senesh wrote it. And so, you know, it's not, I would say the heroines are not so well remembered in general, and then you have to ask if the heroes are so well remembered, you know.
I just want to mention that that's a really important issue, that the heroines are not remembered, and we're developing if anyone's interested, an exhibition of tapestries called Holocaust Heroes, Fierce Females, that focuses on the fact that a lot of women were not recognized.
Do you have Haviva Reich, or can we add her?
Well, we have 10 now, and we can go through. Wittke's in there, and Hannah Senesh is in there. And
but not Haviva Reich.
No, she's not in there, but you know, it was limited to 10 for now, and we could think about expanding,
yeah, please.
right?
All right, we'll talk
and
about that.
We've got pamphlets for anyone interested.
I like the word hero for women. I don't like the word heroine for women. I think of the woman who's being laid across the railroad track, waiting for the brave hero to dash forward and save her.
It's
so
good.
This project is called Holocaust Heroes, Fierce Females.
You're right.
Intentionally.
You're right.
Thank you.
No, now we have actors, not actresses, too. You know, it's the same, yeah.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. I could talk a little about that.
I'm thinking about the... What, you need the mic, please?
I'm thinking about the medical experiments, and women were often subjects for the medical experiments. Is there a lot of research on this? Is this a place where women do have a voice?
Well, there's a lot of research on the medical experiments, you know, about both.
Yeah, there's a lot written about that. Yeah, there's a lot written about that. But again, it's scholastic, so it's something that, you know, you could read about in the Nazi doctors. Jay's book, you know, yeah. There's extensive, and also the Shoah Foundation archives have. It's a keyword authority. It's a part of the keyword is there, but it's scholastic, not sort of public history.
As a comment to your question about sterilization, I just wanted to say something that I find a little shocking is, and which gets to, you know, are the female resistance fighters memorialized, or do we know them? And we do know them somewhat. Definitely Abba Kovner is much better known than the women. Wittke, and the fact that I can't even remember the other woman's name is embarrassing. That's right. But women in Israel, particularly after the war, and here as well, I mean, the greatest thing they could do to show that Hitler didn't win was to reproduce. Now, a lot of women were sterilized, and a lot of women were sterile, and they couldn't have kids. Or, they had lost their periods during the war, and it never came back because they were starved almost to death. So it's still amazing to me that, I'll go through testimonies, or even when I'll go and interview some of these women, I don't ask if they have kids, but I was watching a group of women being interviewed, and one woman who was not able to have kids became incensed when the question was asked, and she got up in tears and was angry and stormed off. And there's still this lack of sensitivity because men have framed Holocaust history, have been reduced to cliches. Be a mother, reproduce the earth, make up for the fact that we lost 6 million, or women are martyrs. And this is something that we talked about yesterday, which is, maybe there's a reason why her mother isn't known, because her mother survived. And there was glory in dying. I mean, the word perished, which is the word that we use for Holocaust survivors, it was dignified to die in the Holocaust. It's not so dignified to have survived. So even women who were heroines, coming across my mother's journal and certainly reading so much about it, there were so many women doing quiet acts of bravery, quiet acts of defiance that we don't know about, because what could compare to having children afterwards?
There's a how many of you eat Eggland's Best Eggs? Okay. So that's Eggland's Best Eggs. That's Harry Eisen, who's a Holocaust survivor from Poland, right? Built this big, they sent him to Los Angeles to run a chicken farm. He didn't know how to run a chicken farm. And he has a beautiful home in Los Angeles. He's a billionaire. And his wife, Hilda, came to the museum to ask me something and whatever, and we started this conversation. And it comes out that she was blonde and blue-eyed, and she worked both for the AK and for the Jewish partisans in Lodz. And I'm shocked. And I said, Hilda, have you ever given your testimony? No. Why would anyone want to hear about that? No one would want to hear about me. I didn't do anything. I just passed messages. I just rode this train and I passed these. It's no big deal. Anyway, did you see how she looked at that affair yesterday? She just would not give her testimony and just wouldn't talk about it and did not consider herself any kind of heroine at all. And she said, nothing bad happened to me. I passed. I didn't go to a camp, so I don't have an experience to tell.
I was just going to add to the question about medical experiments, because I don't know if there's been anything, and maybe Rochelle knows, that has connected the medical experiments and sexual violence, because women were forced to have sex so that they could trace semen in their bodies, and there was sexual violence against some of the men as well who were forced to have sex with them. And I haven't seen anybody particularly draw those two topics together. I don't know if that's true or not.
What were the two topics? Exactly, you said at the beginning, bringing
violence and medical.
And medical experimentation.
Well, we do consider some of these medical experiments sexual violence because they affected women's, reproductive system, sexuality, whatever. If you were asking whether the women were sterilized so they wouldn't reproduce, is that what you were asking? I mean,
a number of women who were basically raped.
Yeah.
And sometimes by the doctors themselves, and then so that they could trace the semen in their bodies.
I haven't.
Afterwards, they did autopsies. But there are, descriptions of those medical experiments.
I'm not familiar, but one of the other panelists.
Something is, that they. Yes, there was forced sex so they could then check on. Yeah, I something about this, but I still don't know what the question is. That's true. That was some kind of horrible experiment, but then what? Then
I would say scholastically they're very tied together. That would be my comment. I think scholastically they're very much one and the same.
First of all, thank you for really opening up so many interesting and important areas. I'd like to add to that opening by mentioning that there is an area of women's writings, Yiddish women writers, that has been totally relegated to oblivion by our co-religionists who have not translated women writers. Fortunately for feminist scholars, if it weren't for feminist scholars, we would be totally ignorant of this. Feminist scholars have begun to introduce Yiddish women's literature. They've translated. There are 2 or 3 anthologies now, and they all include the writings of women during the Holocaust, including Chava Rosenfarb, who was a survivor, Lily Berger, Rachel Korn. I mean, these are wonderful writers who really, their writings were, in some cases, memoirs, in some cases, fictionalized account, but very much in the area of testimony. So we've been deprived now for years because without a translation, how many of us really still retain Yiddish as a written and as a language that we can read? So by not translating, we have been deprived. I mean, I'm glad to say that I was involved with 2 anthologies of Yiddish women writers, but this is one area where it really is an opening to something that we should all know about.
no, I think that's true, and I thank you. But I think not only Yiddish, but there's so much documentation in the Soviet Union that needs to be translated, and I keep asking a friend in Moscow who's at a Holocaust center, oh yeah, but I don't know what it says. And Polish, I paid somebody when I needed Polish testimonies when I worked on a shtetl. It's a problem in general, but of course Yiddish is close to home, so yes.
I just want to give a plug to one of our fellow organizations, one of our partner organizations here, YIVO. I just spoke with Jonathan yesterday. They just launched a huge initiative, which I'm sure some of you read about in the Times a month ago, a huge digitization project. Their issue is they're YIVO, for God's sake. Their whole mission is Yiddish, right? They have legions of Yiddish speakers globally. They are having trouble because some of it, they teach, YIVO teaches Hoch Yiddish, right? High Yiddish. And there's kitchen Yiddish. And there's different dialects of Yiddish. And they literally cannot find people who can translate Lithuanian Yiddish, Northern Lithuanian Yiddish. They can't. And it's the most frustrating. It's why their project is taking so long.
I think I have more observation than question. The rape entered the international legal context because of the Amarska rape camp in Bosnia and because of a documentary, Calling the Ghosts, that was done about that. And the women who were involved in that, including a jurist, were on a global tour that went with that. That was also an opening for Samantha Power over there, and the small number of people who were involved as advocates on the part of Bosnia. You brought up the thing about, quote unquote, illegitimacy, and all illegitimacy having to do with human beings has to be struck from the language. It has to do with the chattel relationship, chattel marriage, chattel children, chattel slavery, are linked at all vital signs. And this is what this relationship is. There has never been an illegitimate person. And we have in the country, obviously everybody knows that the situation for women is going backwards in the country with the help of other women. But we have, it's true. And I sort of have this ridiculous kind of thing. My maternal grandmother knew Margaret Sanger, and my grandmother had an abortion, so that was way, way, way back again. And I knew that as a child, without completely understanding what the meaning of all of that was. So I have a somewhat different perspective about the cowardice and the inability of males to deal with sexuality and being overwhelmed whether or not they're at all interested in women sexually, by that power and how the relationship, should be there. But we have in our legal structure, most people don't know that black marriages were not recognized in this country until the 14th Amendment, which establishes the basic of citizenship. And why? Because most black people were chattel. And because that's how we have a wide spectrum of colors and appearance in black Americans. They were so readily available. And black males had a problem. They had no ability to defend them. So we deal with that across the board. So I thank you for raising that, but I think it's obviously needs the broader context, not just unique to here, where somehow we've adopted the Holocaust as our national holiday, but globally.
I think we could go on all night, but I just wanted to thank my esteemed, wonderful panel, and thank you, Ariella, for being here. It's so appreciative. And thank all of you. And I hope you will. I hope you'll come back. I hope you'll do research, and I hope you'll make CJH a cultural home for yourselves. Thank you.
And see the exhibit.
And see the exhibit.
See the exhibit. It's around the corner when you go out.
And if the exhibit isn't open for some reason, and I suspect it may not be, come back.